Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for part 2 of our series on Tacoma banking. This time we're going to look at the time period of 1893 to 1993. We're going to fly through 100 years looking at some of the major stories of that century. For those of you who don't know me, I worked 20 years for Tacoma Public Library, then spent a decade or more volunteering for Tacoma Historical Society, and recently we've been working on an exhibit on banking in Tacoma, which led to a book, Bank on Tacoma. When we left you off in part 1, we had just gotten to the Panic of 1893 when things got pretty ugly in Tacoma. The city was bankrupt, real estate market was gone, population dropped in half, banks failed, businesses failed. It was an ugly time. And I encourage you to read The Banking Panic of 1893, written by Bruce Ramsey. It's an excellent book on that topic. So how do we get out of something as ugly as the 1893 banking panic? How do we recover from that? Well, I always thought that the gold rush did it, right? But I've learned that that was only a small part of it. And that city to the north of us already had shipping lines in place to Alaska. So anyone who benefited had to come to Tacoma to get their outfits, then go to that city north of us to go up to Alaska. But there was an increase in mining, and people were mining all over the Northwest. But what I learned from reading Bruce Ramsey's book is that what really brought us out of that 1893 panic and that horrible depression were natural resources. Now in Eastern Washington, that's when they started looking at apples. Here in our side of the state, we were definitely looking at mining operations. That's when we saw things like the Ryan smelter take off that became a Sarco. But it's also when we were looking at gold mining, coal up in the mountains. But what really became important were trees. That's when we saw companies like Weyerhaeuser growing. And believe it or not, an incredible industry of shingles. If there's one thing Tacoma and the Northwest had, it was trees. And this is a time when we really saw mills become our major economy strength. And that is really what brought us out of that depression. But that doesn't mean that people were willing to trust banks again. They had lost the money that they were deposited, and with that money, they lost trust. So how are we going to go forward from that? What are we going to do? Well, one thing that worked in Tacoma and across the country were small savings associations. And in the beginning, they were a building and loan where members owned the organization. They purchased shares by making regular payments, and they made home loans only to their members. Those evolved into what we called kind of thrift banks. As they got rid of the membership requirements, it was called a savings and loan. Sometimes it was a mutual society. But all of these are ways that people were saving their money, trying to be homeowners, but not investing in the traditional for-profit bank. Well, we saw a tremendous stability in that industry. The Tacoma Savings and Loan was really the first new bank of any kind formed in Tacoma after the panic, and that started in 1899, and it lasted almost a century. Actually started kind of a new banking district over on 9th and A, 10th and A, not on the 10th and Pacific side where the banks were, but on A Street a little more. And there were several different buildings there. The major Bose building, they built an annex across the street, and then the big American Savings complex that's up by Fireman's Park. But Tacoma Savings and Loan was really stable. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a Tacoma bank. There was a Portland group called the Equitable Savings and Loan, and they opened in Tacoma in 1899 and again lasted almost a century. One of the things I think was exciting about the Equitable is that they built an incredible building up in Hilltop. It was clad in copper, was actually surrounded by a moat, and had bells that played music and chimes at lunch. Probably the one that gets the most attention and that so many people remember is Pacific Building and Loan. And you'll see it went through a complex series of names as the organization changed, as they became federally affiliated. But they were prominent on the corner of 11th and Pacific. One of the things they did, which kind of made history in 1953, they installed the first rotating clock on the Pacific coast. And if you look at that corner today, you'll see that there is still a clock on that corner. And they replaced that building with a modern one with a beautiful fountain in the back. But in 1989, they sold to Royal Trust Co., and that became Washington Mutual. So you'll see a pattern here that we had stability for decades, and then when the 80s and 90s hit, we're in trouble. There are dozens and dozens more of these. And if you have time and want to learn more, you can go to tacomahistory.org. There's a tab for research that has original research for many of our exhibits, from candy to photography. And there are detailed charts there of banks, credit unions, and there's even a PowerPoint of a kind of a walk down Pacific Avenue, look at the buildings. As you learn more about the savings and loans, though, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler alert to tell you that they're going to be in trouble in the 80s and 90s. But there's much more information on the website for tacomahistory.org for the savings and loans and buildings and loans in Tacoma. So if it wasn't savings and loans, what else was stable in Tacoma? Remember we said that there were 4 banks that survived the 1893 banking panic. One of them was Pacific National Bank, formed in 1885, and it anchored the corner of 12th and Pacific in the beautiful old Chamber of Commerce building. Well, it was known for decades as Tacoma's oldest bank, kept that original 1885 charter. How did it do that? Well, by 1905, it was strong enough to absorb the Lumbermen's National Bank. Now, that had started as Scandinavian American Bank, but as these guys come in, Weyerhaeuser, others from the Midwest, from Oregon, they have a pretty strong impact there. So the Pacific National Bank was able to absorb Lumbermen's in 1905. In 1913, though, they did an incredibly smart move from hindsight, and that was to merge with the National Bank of Commerce. So rather than the 2 banks competing with each other, they chose to merge and combine their resources. And together they became the National Bank of Tacoma. And that is a bank that I think some of you may remember fondly, or remember hearing about, or collecting their items. I love their advertising campaign, that they were solid as the mountain. Even though today we know that the mountain might be a dormant volcano, there's some irony in that. But it became the National Bank of Tacoma, still harking back to the Pacific National Bank of 1885. So they built a building at 1125 Pacific, only in Tacoma could that be the corner of 12th and Pacific. That opened in June of 1921. But with the Depression, Transamerica Company was able to buy controlling interest in 1937. With that, they hoped to create a chain of banks in Washington. So they renamed the National Bank of Tacoma the National Bank of Washington, as if we're going to take over the Northwest. In 1950, they built an annex across the street. And I think it's kind of fun that they actually built a tunnel underneath the street to connect the 2 buildings. Those of you who have been in Tacoma for any length of time know that in the 1960s, we had lots of influence in Washington. That means we had some federal money, we had some rehabilitation going on. That means that we demolished a bunch of our old buildings and tore down a lot of the old part of town that many of us would love to have seen not destroyed. As part of that, the bank was able to purchase an entire block from Pacific to A Street, from 12th to 13th, demolish all the buildings on the entire block. And what do you do? Why do you need to do that? You even vacate the street that goes through? Because you're going to build a skyscraper. However, before that skyscraper was even opened, the bank merged with Seattle's Pacific National Bank, and the headquarters were moved to Seattle. So here we were with the skyscraper. It was called the Pacific National Bank of Washington, eventually changed its name to First Interstate, and then that was sold to Wells Fargo. But we have the plaza, no name on the top. Sometimes it's not bad to be owned by an out-of-state bank, or to have an out-of-state bank own a branch in town. The London and San Francisco Bank had gold from England that helped them get through the 1893 banking panic. And in 1905, that entire bank was acquired by the Bank of California. And with that, the Bank of California had a branch in Tacoma for 90 years. A big change, though, was in 1919 when the Bank of California purchased the Fidelity Trust Company Bank in Tacoma. That gave them a building downtown, and within a decade, they built another significant building. Now, I think all of us remember this building because it has been virtually untouched in external appearance for decades. And those of us in preservation and history love that fact. But I don't think that many people realize that it's the fourth one of those buildings that was built. I mean, there was the first one in California, then there was one in Portland, then there was one in Seattle, and then one in Tacoma. And they're all basically the same building. The one in Seattle has a Wikipedia page, no mention whatsoever. So if someone wants to get busy on Wikipedia, do an entry for our Bank of California, our building that is very, very similar. And you put them side by side, you'll see they're twin buildings. But until 1996, Bank of California anchoring downtown. They sold that building in 2003, moved the branch out in 2005. There's one other kind of banking that's been really, really stable, and it was something that was totally new to me. It was a method of banking through the United States Post Office, and the Postal Savings system operated from 1911 to 1966. So you could buy savings stamps or savings bonds, and it was a way of saving a small amount. At first, they were limited to less than $500, got 2% interest. I'm told that recent immigrants to the United States were comfortable with this because this is the kind of banking that they were used to worldwide. And at the time in 1911, it was really one of the few banking systems that was backed by the US government. Well, as time goes on, with the 30s, we create the FDIC, and in the 40s, we have savings bonds. So there are other kinds of investment banking that are backed by the government and pay a higher interest rate. So eventually that system was phased out. I did learn, though, that if you find any of those savings stamps or postal savings bonds, you can still get them redeemed. Those funds were transferred to the state, and if you send them in, you can still get them redeemed. And also within the past 10 years or so, there's been a move that perhaps we should bring back postal banking. And perhaps this would be a way to help our government post office be a service to us and a way to help them. Okay, so in Tacoma, and in the Northwest, 1893 was the Great Depression. But the rest of the country really thinks of 1929 and the 30s as the Great Depression. And during that time, there were many, many homeless camps all across the nation that were men hunting for work. And each area had its own little nickname. Often they were called Hoovervilles. They were those who were unhappy with the president, but each area had their own. In Tacoma, ours was down on the Tide Flats, and it was called Hollywood on the Tide Flats. And you know, it was just a few years ago that I realized that this was a play on the Weaver Studios, who in the 1920s had built down by Titlow Beach an area that was dubbed Hollywood by the Sea. So on the western side of Tacoma in the mid-20s, we had this optimism of Hollywood by the Sea, we're going to have movie studios. And by the 1930s, we have Hollywood on the Tide Flats on the other side of town. Now we know how horrible the jobless situation was. We know how horrible those times were. We know how hard it was to get food. But from a banking standpoint, it was nothing like the 1893 banking panic. And Tacoma only lost 2 banks as a result of the Depression. The first was a Scandinavian American bank. Now this is a little confusing because to my knowledge, from what I've been able to determine, there were 5 different banks using Scandinavian American names in Tacoma. The first operated in the 1890s. That's the one that changed its name to Lumberman. After they did that, that opened up the name so anybody else could come in and serve our Scandinavian American population. However, we got 2 of them. One of them was Scandinavian American State Bank. They realized there was another bank with the same name, opened right away. They changed it to commercial. They ended up just merging with it and becoming Scandinavian American Bank of Tacoma. However, something really important happened in 1917, and that's when Tacoma's Scandinavian American Bank was able to absorb Tacoma's Bankers Trust. And the key to that was that they were able to then get the account to handle the Camp Lewis payroll. And those of you remember from our 1918 exhibit and the work we did then, when the United States entered the war and we started sending soldiers to Camp Lewis, They didn't have an infrastructure yet. They were intense as they were building buildings. And so a lot of their sources, a lot of their business had to be handled elsewhere. So it was a Tacoma bank that was responsible for bringing cash to the soldiers for their paydays. And that is what the Scandinavian American Bank did. And that is why this little picture of a hat that you see up in the corner is really important. That's a souvenir bank that is small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. And that little bank, Scandinavian Bank in Tacoma, Washington, in the shape of that helmet, it was a way for Scandinavian American Bank to advertise from that little giveaway piggy bank that they had the account for the Camp Lewis payroll. However, they were buoyed by that, and they began a major construction project in 1919. And here you see it on the corner of Pacific Avenue as they're doing foundation work in 1920. It's going to be 15 stories. No, it's going to be 17 stories. It's going to cost $1 million. No, it's going to cost $3 million. That bank failed January 16th, 1921. Closed its door, can't do it. Well, Tacoma businessmen rallied. They tried to figure out how they could save it. And I think there's a certain irony in the fact is that they put together 15 community leaders, called it the Committee of 15, which in Tacoma has a notorious history, called it the Committee of 15, trying to assemble enough business support to keep the bank going. But the Seattle arm of the bank also failed. And the bank president, Ole Larson, well, he had dozens of larceny charges against him. After they convicted him on the first 3, they gave up the rest of them and said, that's enough, we got him. But the bank had failed. So this unfinished building was part of Tacoma's skyline for a couple of years. It was completed, though, in 1925 for the Washington, California Company, and that's why it's been known since as the Washington Building. So it's 1019 Pacific Avenue, the Washington Building. So wait a minute, we didn't lose the Scandinavian American Bank in the Depression. That building didn't sit there through the Depression. All of that happened before. All of that had come and gone in the teens and 20s. So we didn't lose the Scandinavian American Bank because of the Depression. When that building was completed in 1925, its new tenant on the first floors was the Brotherhood Cooperative National Bank of Tacoma. That was chartered in 1925, moved into this brand new building. And the whole idea of Brotherhood Cooperative was that most of the stock was owned by railroad workers, engineers, the Brotherhood of Railroad Workers. So this was kind of a union-based bank. And the advertising guys in Tacoma loved it because the sign on top of that building, 30 feet high, 90 feet wide. This is before neon. This is individual light bulbs. Pretty exciting thing to have that Brotherhood Bank on our skyline by the mountain. And again, a fabulous picture from Tacoma Public Library. We're so fortunate how they share those. So this Brotherhood Cooperative Bank, however, did not survive the stock market crash. As a result of that, in November 1929, the company in San Francisco called Calatallo Investment was able to buy controlling interest of the bank. So the Brotherhood lost interest in their own bank. They renamed it the Washington National Bank. Yes, that took more than 3,000 electric light bulbs to change the sign. However, in January of 1932, the state officials came in and closed several banks in Tacoma. This was one of them. And the state officials said, you're still open, but you're on thin ice. We're not going to risk it. We're going to shut you down. We're going to handle it ourselves. Within 5 years, 80% of the deposits had been returned and the books were burned at the city landfill. So yes, the Washington National Bank, which began as the Brotherhood Cooperative Bank, was one of 2 banks that failed in Tacoma. Well, I thought the other one was the Central Bank. That was incorporated in 1925. It was built on 6th and Pine, right where there's a jog on 6th Avenue. And the cool thing about that was it was sponsored by Young Men's Business Association, 6th Avenue merchants. The whole idea is that they would have a local bank on 6th Avenue. You wouldn't have to go downtown to bank. To make it more convenient, you could pay your gas bill there. And they really wanted it to be a community hub. However, that too was a fairly new bank at the time, just as the Depression was taking over. So when the state was closing banks in 1932, they closed the central bank and said, no, we're going to have to take over from here. You're just not on strong enough footing to go. But wait, this was a community bank supported by the community. So within 2 months, they were able to reopen. And they did that by writing letters to every one of their depositors, by working with them individually and negotiating waivers. So everybody who had money deposited agreed that they would take money out, but they would leave 25% available. So they basically said, I can take out up to 75%. You'll reopen, I'll leave 25% in. That's enough to get you through. And that way, central bank was able to reopen and continue their influence. I mean, they worked for years to get a traffic light at that intersection. They sent someone to Washington, D.C. to campaign for legislation to get the Narrows Bridge built. And then they campaigned to get 6th Avenue repaired after the Narrows Bridge was built. However, in 1965, that bank was acquired by the People's National Bank of that city north of us. So technically, central bank didn't lose because of the Depression. The third bank, though, which was really the second bank, was the Lincoln Bank. And that was chartered about the same time, just a few months later in 1925, and a few of the officers were the same people. So again, a community bank over in the Lincoln District, supported by neighborhood businesses. That also was closed January 28, 1932 by state officials. It was not able to reopen. I think that what happened was they put their efforts on saving the central bank and let the Lincoln Bank go. So with the legislation that happened in the 30s, they created the concept of branch banks so that banks didn't have to start a new bank in a new neighborhood. They could have a branch of the same bank. And Puget Sound Bank was able to open a branch there in 1935, serving that community that way. So what's the big story in the 30s? What's the growth in the 40s and 50s? We're kind of cautious with our banks. We've gotten through the Depression. The huge growth over the next 3 decades is in credit unions. And we did a program in June that's available on the Tacoma Historical Society website, looking at those credit unions. Just a brief touch on them here. Created by the legislation in 1934 for President Roosevelt. And we have the father of credit unions over there. And basically the big idea is, how is a credit union different from a bank? Well, first of all, it's nonprofit. Kind of like those buildings and loans we're looking at, whether it's a member cooperative. But in this case, members are united through where they work or where they live. And because of that, they may have their credit union within their factory where they're employed, or within a school where they're employed. We've discovered over 130 credit unions that have operated in the Tacoma area. They kind of mirror the manufacturing and industry in Tacoma. And if you look at who's still operating on their original charter, it means that the oldest financial institution in Tacoma is Tapco Credit Union. Then we went through an incredible dry period. From 1930 to 1963, not a single new bank charter was issued in Tacoma. And technically, the 1930 was a reissue. So really, from 1925 to 1963, there were no new banks started. The state, federal would not issue new charters, could not do it. It took until the 60s that we could finally start new banks again. And the first one to get a charter to operate was the South Tacoma State Bank, 58th and South Tacoma Way. When they moved downtown and opened other branches, rather than South Tacoma, they became Bank of Tacoma, one of 4 banks to have that name. And in 1969, they were acquired by the First National, later became part of Bank of America. So again, we're starting a trend. Let's start a bank, let's have some branches, let's expand a little. And if there's an opportunity to sell, our shareholders are going to take it. In the 70s, here's a perfect example of how that's done. Western Community Bank opened in a temporary building in Fircrest. They were able to open branches. They were able to form a parent company, which allowed them to buy other banks. They expand. And by 1988, they're at really a crossroads. Do we go big or do we go home? And they chose to take the money. They're investors, after all, who started a bank. And the bank officers may not have felt that way, but the investors and the shareholders voted to sell. And so Western Community Bank sold to Key Corporation. And it was really seen at the time as kind of a beachhead move. It was the first big move to bring Key Bank into Pierce County. Another bank like that, Tacoma Commercial Bank, only lasted from 71 to 77. Shortened its name to Tacoma Bank, opened a UP branch. By 1987, they have 6 branches. They have a mortgage subsidiary. But in 1990, they're acquired by West One Bank. Another in 1981, First Security Bank, same thing. Had your branches, loan offices. They were acquired by the Moore Financial Group. The name became West One. And they were able to buy Bank of Tacoma, but they moved their headquarters to Bellevue and eventually merged into US Bank of Washington. Not a single one of Tacoma's recent banks from the 60s, 70s, 80s, not one survived as an independent bank. Not one. Now, on top of that, we have the savings and loans crisis. And I don't have to tell you, you've lived through it. You know what happened. Between 1986 and 1998, nearly a third of the nation's savings and loans failed. Now, I'm not a banking expert. I like doing research, but from what I understand, there were rate wars in the 60s, and the savings and loans had offered guaranteed interest rates. But when inflation went up in the 70s, they were locked into those rates. And the big thing that happened in Tacoma was that we had tons of out-of-city, out-of-town banks that opened branches in Tacoma, and we just saturated the market. On top of that, in 1980, there was something called deregulation that allowed speculative investment. Oh, I think it's a good idea to take the money we have in our bank assets and invest them in, I don't know, oil drilling in Texas. That's going to be good forever, right? And that's when there's a problem. Here's a list of some of the many savings and loans that crashed in Tacoma, that were sold, acquired, merged, many of them from out of town. But a crisis in banking. So 70s, 80s, 90s, not good times for Tacoma for independent banking. Simply not there anymore. So who's left? Some of you may recognize that ad. Well, there's one we haven't talked about. Remember I said that Malin was a car dealer on South Tacoma Way? His competition was the Wallerich family. The 3 generations of the family had led the North Pacific Bank. It was formed in 1906, was always in South Tacoma, although they had branches elsewhere. And they anchored that. They also happened to be car dealers. So when they got a new drive-through, it was a good opportunity for them to cross-promote both of their industries. During the 90s, from 1992 to 1998, North Pacific Bank was Tacoma's last independent bank until it was sold to Heritage Bank in 1998. And Tacoma had no more independent banks. Now there's a big bank we have not talked about yet, and that's Puget Sound. I don't have to tell you, you've been here, you remember it. This Who's Left ad was what Reno Adlin put in the paper in 1969. All these other banks are going away, they're selling, they're merging. We're not going to do that. Puget Sound had several names from 1890. Was it a state bank, bank and trust, a national bank. In the 20s, they opened a Broadway bank, but that was able to come back as a branch. But I think many of you, when you think of Puget Sound Bank, think of the National Realty Building. That's on 11th and Pacific Avenue. There's a postcard from the early days with a beautiful building with a pyramid on top. As it became Bank and Trust, you'll see the elaborate stonework on the front. And then the picture on the right is when they reclad the first 3 floors in granite. Let's cover up that work. So a pretty impressive building. Reno Adlin did a couple of other things too, leading Puget Sound forward. But the big one was that in the 60s, he got hooked by this thing called a computer. And he brought in Gordon Roberts. I may have done that wrong. And they brought in a computer to handle the processing of their checks. Rather than handling every single check individually, they could put the stacks of checks into a machine, sort them through, and process all these checks. The book that is written on the history of the bank tells us that there was a delegation of other bankers from Tacoma who came to them and said, please don't do this. Please don't do this. This is not a step we want to take. It is going to change the face of banking forever. Why? Because the only way you can run these checks through a machine is if you number the accounts. And Tacoma, until the 1960s, had names on bank accounts, not numbers. And they really saw that as a change in banking when your account had to be considered with a number, not a name. Puget Sound was prominent for, and is the only bank in Tacoma that celebrated a centennial. And his name was Bob Gordon. It just came back to me. Thank you. There's a quote, you can only shear a sheep. You can shear a sheep every year, but you can only skin it once. They resisted and resisted selling. However, in 1992, shareholders voted to take advantage of an opportunity. Puget Sound Bancorp and its banks were sold to KeyCorp, which was operating as Key Bank of Puget Sound. So who's left? What's happening to our independent banks in Tacoma? Bank of Tacoma sold to West One in 1990. Puget Sound sold to Key in 92. North Pacific, Tacoma's last independent, sold to Heritage in 1998. We still had the Bank of Summer, that sold to Frontier in 2010. And the last independent bank in the county, Puyallup Valley, sold to Heritage in 2013. So what are we going to do? You start over. Sound Banking Company was formed in Lakewood by people who had originally worked with Western Community Bank. Their bank was sold. They went off and started a new one. The same thing with Columbia State Bank. That was formed in 1993, partially by former officials of the Puget Sound National Bank. And I am told that the similarity of logos is not a coincidence. And full disclosure, we were thrilled to thank Columbia Bank for sponsoring the banking exhibit. So I thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've learned something about our Tacoma's banking history. We have a few other lectures and talks available on the Tacoma Historical Society YouTube channel. You can get to them through Facebook, through our webpage, or through YouTube. And we also, if you're feeling comfortable that you've learned a lot about banks and you want to play an old-style Jeopardy game, we have a Jeopardy game on banking available on our website. Plus, as we mentioned, those databases of original research. And if you decide you really want to read that book on Bank on Tacoma, if you can't get into the store to get it, you can get it on Amazon. But I would encourage you to use the Amazon Smile so that Tacoma Historical Society benefits from that. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope you enjoyed this little walk back through a decade of Tacoma banking.